good morning, Singapore and Australia. Good day to those of you who are joining us from other parts of the world. Welcome to the fifth presentation from the People's Cultures and Careers Research Cluster here at James Cook University in Singapore. So for those who don't know me, my name is Ed Ng. I'm your host for today's webinar on From Survivor to Thriver, a scoping review of the return to work experiences of cancer survivors. In case you're wondering, it is 10 p.m. for me. I am joining you all from Kingston, Ontario, Canada, which is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay my respects to the elders past and present. We are grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on this land. I'm also a visiting professor of organizational behavior, and I organize the People, Cultures, and Careers Research Cluster at JCU Business School in Singapore. In fact, I will be visiting Singapore at the end of the semester here for me, at the end of April, early May. So if you happen to be there, I very much look forward to engaging with you. So as a group, we are very vibrant and diverse. A good group of us are engaged on research on people, work in organizations. If you're interested in collaborating with any of us, please feel free to reach out. You can check us out on the JCU Singapore website. Now, for today's presentation, I am pleased to introduce to you Dr. Carrie Chan. Carrie, do you want to turn on your camera so we can all welcome you? All right, Dr. Chan is a senior lecturer, sort of associate professor in North American nomenclature. She is a senior lecturer in organizational behavior and human resources at Griffith Business School. She conducts research on work-life interface, work-related stress and burnout, return to work, which is the topic of her research today, and leader-subordinate interactions. She is the associate editor for the International Journal of Stress Management and an editorial board member of the Journal of Vocational Behavior. Her work has been published in leading OB/HR journals. She is a member of Griffith's Center for Work Organization and Wellbeing, as well as an international affiliate of our People's Cultures and Careers Research Cluster here at JCU Singapore. Now, Carrie's presentation today is based on a project which she leads at Griffith, jointly with Hannover Life and Reinsurance of Australasia. Together, they have examined research from 320 studies globally on cancer survivors' return to work experiences. Now, having a partner who is a cancer survivor, I have been looking forward to Carrie's presentation since she has agreed to come to our webinar for today. The questions that we have for Carrie's are, what are some of the challenges, barriers, and facilitators that contribute to cancer patient rehabilitation? And more importantly, how can we develop effective interventions to support survivors on their recovery pathway? Now, to answer this question, Dr. Carrie Chan will be sharing her insights with us. But before we begin, here are a few housekeeping items. The webinar today will be recorded for publicity purposes. You will be able to ask questions at any point of the webinar through the Q&A function. Nicole had posted some notes for you there. Q&A will also be available at the end of the presentation, so you can just type in your questions on chat and I will read them out for you. There will be a satisfaction poll and survey at the end of the webinar. So please take 2 minutes to complete the survey. Your feedback is very important to help us improve and bring topics that are of interest to you. And if you encounter any technical issues, use the chat button to communicate with the event organizers. Nicole is standing by to actually help if you encounter any of the challenges at all with IT. Now, I'm going to step off and let Carrie take over. I'll step back in when it's time for our Q&A. Carrie, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Ed, for having me today, and really warm welcome to this webinar. And I am presenting from Brisbane, Australia, and here we are at 12 p.m. noontime. And I'm actually originally from Singapore, so I'm actually very familiar with James Cook University, Singapore. So I really thank Ed for this opportunity to present to everyone today. As Ed mentioned, this research is done in collaboration with my industry partners, Hannover Life Re of Australasia. They are part of the Hannover Re Group, which is the third largest reinsurance group in the world. And so they are a very well-known life insurer. And obviously, they also have a major footprint here in Australia, and they're headquartered in Sydney. And so in terms of the goal of this scoping review that I'm doing today is obviously for us to understand what has been done to date in terms of the research. And so we wanted to focus obviously on the barriers, challenges, and mindsets of cancer customers return to work or cancer survivors. Customers was used because this was done in the life insurance context. And we really wanted to know what has been done to date so that we don't replicate what has been done and we conduct research that is meaningful and will value add to the current research and obviously the life insurance customers. And so in terms of the economic impact as to why we're doing this, well, cancer affects a lot of people in the world. And in Australia, we are also not spared from the effects of cancer. As you can see here, several studies published in recent years show that about 40% of people who are cancer patients are actually of working age. And about half of them are not able to return to work after diagnosis. And about 70% of them actually experience a change in employment status, most of the time a reduction in work hours or work status. And this actually cost the Australian economy about 1.7 billion Australian dollars, which is not good, obviously. And obviously the high prevalence and significant economic impact underscores the need for us to understand and address the challenges of returning to work for cancer survivors. And so this is the quick literature search that we did. And in terms of the key terms and the Boolean operators, obviously we kept them broad because we wanted to scope as widely as possible. And this was done in late 2023. We concluded this research in the middle of last year. And so obviously we focus on research that collected data. They could be quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods. They had to obviously be in English because that was what we were all sort of familiar with, and they had to be peer-reviewed and scholarly articles. And so after 2 rounds of review, the first one is a quick abstract screening. The second one was a full text review. We were left with a final sample of 320 journal articles that we actually went on to code. And so the stuff that we coded for in the next couple of slides. So the first thing that we coded for was obviously the country. As you can see here, a lot of the research was still coming up from the United States. Then we had Netherlands and a couple of countries in Europe, and then we had Australia, and last but not least, we had Japan and Taiwan from the Asian continent. And a lot of people were quite surprised as to why Netherlands were actually the second most frequently coded country for the studies. And so for the Netherlands, they're actually quite a small country, but they are also very research oriented and research focused. And so that was why it was not so surprising, at least for me, when I sort of coded the studies to show that they also had quite a lot of cancer research coming up from that country. In terms of the most commonly examined sort of cancer type, obviously we had breast cancer emerging as the most frequently coded, followed by bowel, colon, and rectal and colorectal cancer, head and neck cancer. At the same time, there were studies that actually focus on multiple types of cancer. So that was why it was a lot harder and more complex for us to code them. But here are some of the most studied cancer types across the 320 studies. In terms of the gender breakdown as well, there's a bit of a gender gap or gender difference when it comes to the cancer type. Obviously, a lot of the studies focus more on women. And so as you can see here, women were like about 70% of the sample most of the time. And so for women, the most frequently studied types of cancer was breast cancer, cervical cancer, and gynecological cancer. And for males, it was prostate cancer and bowel, colon, colorectal, and rectal cancer. And in terms of the male population, across most of the study, about 35% of them was male. And so obviously this also indicates some sort of gap or potential area of research. We might need to increase our study on the male population. In terms of the main treatment type that was sort of emerged from the studies, obviously the first one was surgery, followed by chemo and radiotherapy, and the more sort of new treatment type like immunotherapy and hormone therapy were less frequently coded. And at the same time, there were also a lot of studies that had multiple treatment types. And so in that particular aspect, it was also harder to sort of code specifically. And sometimes the studies also did not specify the type of treatment, which is obviously an area that should be addressed going forward. In terms of the specific rehab type, well, this was a clear weakness across the studies that were shortlisted. As you can see over here, a lot of studies actually had multiple, or they didn't actually specify the specific rehab type. Then in terms of those that did specify, a lot of them were medical rehab, OT rehab, psychology rehab, and then just one or two studies were pharmacy related or social work related rehabilitation programs. And so this is obviously something that should be addressed going forward because as part of the return to work process, the specific rehab type will play a crucial role. And now obviously this is something that we are all interested in, the return to work success rate. And obviously for some of them, the studies were quite small. It was like a small qualitative study. There was like 100% return rate because the sample could comprise of people who have already successfully returned to work. And then we also had very large cohort studies of national populations. And so you can see that here, the return to work success rate does actually vary a great deal. The average success rate was about 67% and the median was 70%. But at the same time, we had a large standard variation of about 20%. Again, showing that some studies were really small, some studies were really large. And so it was really hard to compare the actual return to work success rate. At the same time, we also had studies that did not specify a successful return to work success rate. And then we had studies with multiple studies and they had multiple return to work success rate. And so that made calculation a little bit harder. And so in terms of just an overview, this was what I sort of calculated across the 320 studies. In terms of the research design, I guess this is what a lot of researchers will be very interested in. Predominantly, they were all quantitative or qualitative, and there were a few that were mixed methods. At the same time, just very disappointingly, a lot of the studies were actually cross-sectional, so they were only conducted at a point in time. And this is a clear weakness as well because the return to work is a process. And so if you're capturing experiences at one point in time, this does not obviously capture the full return to work process. There were a few studies that were longitudinal, so that was good. But again, sometimes they could only be like time lag of 2 or 3 time points, and they don't really show the full picture of return to work. Some studies were also experimental intervention studies. And so they had a pre and post design. And some studies with multiple studies had multiple types of like either cross-sectional or longitudinal. And so that made coding a little bit more difficult, but that's fine. And so there were just a few of them. And so this was the sort of framework that really emerged when we started coding. And so a lot of studies were quite simple in their design. And so obviously there will be the cancer diagnosis, and then the outcome is either actual return to work or some of the associated return to work outcomes like job satisfaction, performance, productivity. And obviously we were interested in the facilitators of return to work. So these were the positive factors that promoted return to work. And at the same time, we are also interested in the barriers to return to work, which is the negative factors that prevented cancer survivors from returning to work. And so this sort of overarching framework just sort of provided us with a pictorial diagram to guide us in our coding process and to make sense of the research. And so these were the barriers to return to work that have emerged and we really coded for across the 320 studies. And first up, we have the cancer-related barriers of the cancer itself. And so this was like disease severity, symptoms and side effects of cancer, as well as their surgical complications. And obviously the most frequently coded one was the symptoms and side effects. As you can see over here in a qualitative study, a quote, they talk about dryness in their mouth and, sense of taste that sort of was affected by the cancer. And so that sort of prevented them from, returning to work, because it was obviously with vomiting and nausea, it made returning back to work very hard. And the second set of barriers were therapy related. And so you can see the most frequently emerged therapy related barrier was fatigue. Fatigue is also confirmed by a lot of rehab providers and medical professionals to be the #1 barrier for cancer survivors to return to work. And at the same time, we had other side effects like, the vomiting, the nausea, the loss of appetite, hair loss, dryness, soreness, and so forth. And so this is just a snapshot of the most frequently coded therapy-related effects or barriers to return to work. Now we move on to the survivor's mindset. So this is really the internal, like the self-beliefs and the self-concept of the cancer customers. The most frequently coded one over here was obviously the psychological and mental health, which is also in more recent times a focus on a lot of the cancer-related and return to work studies. In fact, some studies would claim that psychological and mental health is the #1 barrier. But obviously, this does not compare as compared to fatigue. This is only coded about 135 times. Fatigue was coded like 241 times. And so when we look at the evidence shows that fatigue is still #1, followed by psychological and mental health impacts. And at the same time, we also had obviously the self-efficacy, the self-belief in their own ability to return to work. And at the same time, their expectations about return to work and the change in priorities. And so over here, you can see another quote in the study. There is no need to return to work immediately. For me, it was a time to stop, explore what is going on and how to cope with these news. And so for some cancer survivors, cancer patients, when cancer sort of occurred to them, they were not sort of in a rush to go back to work. And so obviously this is something to take into consideration, especially for most organizations and even rehab providers. Sometimes their ultimate goal is to get patients back to work as early as possible, but this may not always be the wish and the intention of the cancer survivors, because sometimes they need time to sort of process the news and to decide next steps. And for a lot of cancer survivors that I've sort of interviewed in subsequent studies, a lot of them told me that they don't actually want to return to work so fast, because they've realized the importance of life beyond work. And so this is, again, goes back to the changes in priorities and outlook when cancer occurs, and obviously people need time to process and to decide next steps. The next set of barriers have to do with obviously the social economic status of the cancer survivors themselves. And so for a lot of them, cancer is not cheap. As you know, cancer treatment is never cheap, even across the world. And so financial commitments was a key barrier in this particular context. And obviously, age was another factor. You would expect that the older the cancer survivor, the lower the rate of return to work, because obviously their body takes a longer time to respond to treatment, and at the same time, fatigue could be a very big barrier. And so the older they age, obviously, the least likely it was for them to return to work. At the same time, an educational background as well. The more educated the cancer survivor, the more likely they were to return to work. But obviously, the less educated they were, they might not be returning to work as fast or as smoothly. And so I just wanted to draw your attention to the idea of financial toxicity. Well, financial toxicity is actually a key research area in cancer return to work research right now. And it's really the financial burden caused by cancer treatment itself. Usually it involves the direct medical cost as well as the indirect cost like lost income, transportation, the time spent worrying about the cancer itself, and anxiety, depression, and just basically worrying about stuff. And so financial toxicity has been shown to be a significant hinder to the ability to return to work, and often leading to distress and as well as regret, embarrassment, and fear of being a burden to some other people and to their families. And some of the most vulnerable population is women, individuals with lower incomes, and those with more advanced cancer stages. They are very prone to financial toxicity. And at the same time, that's why I did this research with life insurers, because life insurance can provide that financial safety net for a lot of cancer survivors who are navigating return to work, who are navigating cancer treatment and all the cost involved. And now we move on to the work-related barriers. I guess this is also something that a lot of workplace researchers like myself will be most interested in. We want to know if the workplace is conducive for cancer survivors to return to work. And so what we found is that a lot of workplace characteristics, the employer's attitude, the co-worker's attitude, and the way it's being communicated, and also the lack of flexibility are very key, some of the key work-related barriers to return to work. As you can see over here, a quote from a study: "I was never offered to come back part-time or to come back as a test run, and subsequently, I guess I kept getting ill, or I was very low in energy and suffering complications from the surgery." And so the lack of flexibility is obviously a great impediment to return to work, because as you saw in the earlier slides, a lot of cancer patients are impacted by cancer treatment. They are fatigued, they have anxiety and depression issue, and so some of them would prefer a gradual return to work, but sometimes employers are not really understanding of the cancer itself until obviously it happens to them, and sometimes there's a lack of empathy and understanding, and that really hinders the cancer survivors from wanting to return to work. And some of the very last barrier that we sort of coded for was obviously the comorbidities, so previous or current medical conditions. As you can see over here, depression and anxiety and other mental illness have emerged as one of the key comorbidities that prevent cancer survivors from returning to work faster or smoother. And so now we move on to the facilitators of return to work. I must say that across the studies, a lot of focus was put on the barriers, and there were much fewer studies that really focus on the facilitators of return to work. And so across the 320 studies, these were the key facilitators that emerged. And so the first one is, again, sort of the socioeconomic status, the age, the financial independence. So obviously when the cancer survivors were more financially independent and they had the more financial means, they were more likely to return to work successfully. And obviously the educational background also emerged as one of the facilitators. In terms of the intervention, I want to draw your attention to the physical intervention that was cited in about 107 studies across the pool of studies that we coded for. You would see that exercise has itself become a very key facilitator of return to work. And there's also a greater recognition that even though cancer survivors might be fatigued, some exercise actually helps them to return to work more successfully. At the same time, the studies also focus on some of the psychological intervention, the psychosocial intervention of seeking help, support groups and networks, and some of the occupational therapy and occupational related intervention really helped cancer survivors to return to work. At the same time, there were a lot of studies that combine different forms of interventions in helping cancer survivors to return to work. At the same time, in terms of the survivor's mindset, you can see over here, a good psychological and mental health would obviously promote successful return to work. But at the same time, their own expectations about return to work was very crucial, as well as their perceived workability. So the perceived workability is obviously their own belief and their own ability and their functional capacity to return to work. And so obviously the higher the perceived workability, the more likely they were to return to work. And so as you can see over here, sometimes in this particular quote here, some people just want to put it to one side and get on with it. So I guess their work ethic or how they deal with difficult situations come into it as well. So this is a recognition that sometimes some of the cancer survivors have also a very strong work ethic and they want to return to work. And sometimes it's a good way to sort of distract them from the cancer severity and the treatment. And in terms of the work-related facilitators, as you can see over here, the more workplace accommodations there were, the more likely they were to return to work, greater organizational support, more resources, better co-worker support, and more positive and more empathetic communication style also promoted a better return to work. And last but not least, workplace flexibility. Flexibility in work hours and duties, as the quote shows, was also a significant facilitator of return to work. And last but not least, we're looking at the outcomes. So the actual return to work and the related outcomes like work-related, life-related, and biopsychosocial outcomes. And so obviously for work-related outcomes, a lot of the studies focus obviously on the job satisfaction, the job performance, and the productivity. As expected, a lot of organizations would expect performance and productivity to be a key outcome because obviously they want the cancer survivors to be, fully functioning and when they return to work. And so in terms of the life-related one, you can see that quality of life emerged as the most frequently quoted, followed by life satisfaction, family functioning, marital satisfaction, and last but not least, sex and intimacy. And in terms of the biopsychosocial outcomes, you can also see that physical health is one of the most frequently coded, as well as mental health and anxiety, depression, and stress. Again, showing a greater recognition of psychological and mental health in the cancer return to work process. And so we also coded and thematically analyzed the recommendations from all the 320 studies that were published and that we considered in a scoping review. The first set of recommendations had to do with obviously a more intense and earlier intervention and greater collaboration between the rehab providers and the clinicians like the oncologists, the GPs, and the nurses. And so this was the first set of recommendation. In terms of the second set was a more sort of customized and personalized return to work program, and also more counseling and more better support for self-employed patients. Because obviously for patients who are employed by an employer, they would have the support from their organization. But if you're self-employed or you're employed in a family business, in terms of the resources, that might not be as much. And so obviously for some self-employed patients, they might also have life insurance. And so that provides an additional form of support for them. And the last set of support was obviously a lot more like education, advocacy, and support to empower cancer survivors to learn more about their own conditions, to know more about themselves, and to help them ultimately return to work faster. And so that were the three themes or three main themes of support and recommendations that emerged from the literature. And so I also wanted to highlight to you that some of the studies highlighted the potential of technology in supporting cancer survivors to return to work better. And as you know, this remains obviously an untapped space. There will be some life insurance that have actually jumped onto this digital coaching and digital platforms because they're better resourced. But for a lot of cancer patients and survivors out there, they might not have access to all these digital interventions. But I do want to highlight that a lot of people are finding that the digital intervention provides a lot more promises because obviously when you're providing support through digital platforms, it's more accessible and convenient for cancer survivors to access, especially when you're undergoing treatment and they're fatigued. And at the same time, there's a lot more resources available online that they can access to sort of like learn more about how they can return to work better or to recuperate faster. And at the same time, a lot more coaching interventions right now can also be delivered online. And so this obviously might help to increase the return to work success rate and to reduce the time it takes to return to work. And last but not least, with digital platforms, you can see that they are quite complementary to some of the traditional rehab programs that are delivered face-to-face. And so this remains an area of potential development for both practical and research sort of interventions. And also, I do want to highlight the role of life insurance because ultimately my research was done in collaboration with Hannover Re. And again, I'm very thankful for their support. But ultimately, in terms of the insurance and the extra safety net that might be provided by a life insurance company, or in the Australian setting, they do have quite generous support for people who are chronically ill. And so life insurance does provide the additional safety net to alleviate financial toxicity. And at the same time, ultimately, for a lot of the cancer survivors that I've interviewed, they always mention a sort of embarrassment and being a burden to their caregivers, like their family members. And so obviously with life insurance support, that allows them to alleviate that layer of stress and anxiety and to really focus on their health and return to work. And at the same time, right now, rehab programs provided by a lot of life insurance are actually very advanced and very multifaceted. And so alongside obviously like, psychological coaching, cognitive-based therapy, exercise physiology, psychotherapy, and so forth, a lot of them also provide like education and counseling and advocacy. So it actually helps cancer patient to be more involved in their own return to work. And obviously they go above and beyond traditional benefits, beyond just monetary support, but providing a more sort of holistic support for cancer survivors. And in terms of the future research direction, as I mentioned earlier, we've touched on some of them in the recommendations from the literature, but a lot of them are still, a lot of the studies are obviously focused on the predominant cancer groups. And as you can see, they're also emerging from the North American setting and the European setting. And so we really want the research to be really focused upon some of the underrepresented groups that have not been studied. Obviously, one of the group is a man, and at the same time, people from rural areas who might not have access to treatment or at all. And at the same time, for underdeveloped and developing countries, that remains obviously a very nascent area. At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the studies were cross-sectional. And so we really want to pour in more resources to conduct more longitudinal studies that really track the long-term impacts of cancer survivors and their return to work over time. Because we want obviously the return to work to be sustained and not just captured at a moment in time. At the same time, we also want longitudinal studies because we want to analyze and examine the effectiveness of some of the interventions implemented out there. Because with cross-sectional study, you might have a patient saying that this is good, but does it really predict return to work over time? And so this is why long-term outcomes and more studies on intervention effectiveness would be useful. And last but not least, I think there is obviously a lot more potential to touch on technology, to leverage technology to provide a more holistic rehabilitation support for cancer survivors. And I do want to end off with obviously a sort of call to action as well for the various stakeholders that are involved in the return to work process of cancer survivors. You can see that a lot of the recommendations were for the rehab providers, the clinicians, and the healthcare providers. But more importantly, one of the missing sort of key players, the employers. A lot of employers still remain very unempathetic and not understanding for cancer survivors and their return to work process. And so we want them to come to the table and to obviously step up and to be more invested in their employees' return to work. At the same time, we also want policymakers to obviously continue and to sort of enhance the employment rights of cancer survivors and to promote workplace inclusivity for them. And obviously, there is also a greater role that life insurance can play in designing more innovative product and to embark on research and design to come up with more innovative intervention solutions for cancer survivors and their return to work. Ultimately, collaboration is key. We want all the stakeholders to be talking to one another because sometimes there seems to be a communication gap to empower and to support more cancer survivors to return to work successfully. And so I've reached the end of my presentation, and I welcome any questions, comments, and suggestions. Back to you, Eddie.
Great. Thank you, Carrie, for some really valuable insights from your cancer rehabilitation work. That was a lot of information, and you have been able to synthesize a lot of the key findings from the studies you reviewed for us here. I want to kind of take a look and see if there are questions. Oh, there are some personal private questions here. From some of the audience members. I'll pick and choose those that come to me. I do apologize if yours was not picked, but do get them coming. So we have quite a bit of time. We will be able to get to all the questions. Hey, curious, but before we get to the audience questions, one of the things that really struck me was on one of your slides, you mentioned that the return to work success rate varies quite a bit from, say, 8% to 100%. Why is there such a big difference from the studies that you reviewed? Because to me, what we're hoping to see is, the ability to predict a high success rate. But that also tells us why some of the response rates are low. But I want to hear your explanation or your thoughts in terms of that large discrepancy.
Yeah, well, Eddie, thank you for the question. And this is something that is always picked up by a lot of researchers and even like healthcare providers when I present. Because the studies itself, as I told you earlier, sometimes they could be as small as like a handful of participants in a small qualitative study, and 100% of them have already returned to work. So their return to work is 100%. But at the same time, we have really large cohort studies of populations across multiple time points, and they could be like hundreds of thousands of cancer patients. And so in that context, you can see that the sample size is much larger. And so the return to work rate will obviously vary in terms of the standard deviation. But at the same time, I do want to highlight to you some of the inconsistencies in the study. Some studies could assess return to work with a simple question like, have you returned to work, yes or no? But the sort of definition for a lot of research studies is that you have only returned to work if you have sustained employment for a period of 3 months or more. And so this is the inconsistency that we face. And so, I mean, for the purpose of the scoping review, I'll just say yes or no right now, because I didn't go into specific whether they assess it as 3 months or more. And so that's why the variation is very wide. But speaking to many life insurance providers, obviously through my industry partner, they've said that 67% sounds about right, because across obviously their cancer cohort and their cancer patients, about 67% of them do eventually return to work successfully. And then there's just about that 30% that sort of choose not to return to work for a variety of reasons. And so we're quite happy with the finding, but at the same time, I think the way we assess return to work has to be improved.
Okay, that is actually helpful to know, right? It gives us some context in terms of interpreting the results that you have here. So I have a question here from Kai-Chen, who actually asked, when you speak of return to work, is it returning to the same employer, or would that be returning to work, but it could be a different employer? Part of this, of course, is some workplaces are actually could be a contributing factor to, to cancer itself. Whether it's environmental or whether it's a climate that contributes to exacerbating some of the underlying conditions, and hence the cancer might manifest itself. So in this case, maybe you can give us a bit of a sense in terms of whether they are actually returning to work to the same employer or might be a different employer. Also, from an environmental perspective, some of it is returning back to work to a toxic environment, which actually caused the cancer to begin with. So I'm not sure if this is actually helpful to the cancer survivors, and if there might be relapse, right?
Yeah, I mean, Ed and Kai-Chen is a very good question. Most of the time, if they return to the same employer, it's always a reduction in work hours, because obviously in terms of their mental capacity, It's just being impaired right now with the cancer treatment. It's actually very potent, and the fatigue just prevents them from working that full-time load in the past. But you're quite right. So in the studies as well, there's multiple outcomes. Okay, there are return to the same employer but reduce hour, return to the same employer but different job scope and different role. So that's also quite frequent. But there are also a lot of them who might leave their previous profession. Like sometimes I've sort of look at some of the finance and banking or accounting sort of studies. They might be in a very intense role in the part in pre-cancer, and so after they return to work, they've obviously gone into like a government job that is less intense, and so that change in employer or even career exit is also quite prevalent. And obviously, there are also some who exit the workforce altogether, as I mentioned to you earlier.
Hey, thanks for that. Lisa actually has a question. She literally took the question right out of my mouth. She is a fellow Canadian. She is actually a professor in Edmonton, Alberta. So sitting up in Canada, we can help comparing ourselves to the Americans. So we have a public health system, oftentimes referred to as socialized medicine compared to the US. So in Canada, healthcare is publicly funded. So clearly there could be potential differences in terms of the type of care, the coverage, and on top of it, even within Canada, we have variations between provinces in terms of, the coverage and the scope of care, right? So I'm curious to hear from you, whether from your studies, the type of system actually may impact or influence the outcomes and the percentage of cancer patients that are able to return to work. Also, in Canada, we do have some insurance coverage. They don't generally cover post-cancer support. So just want to get a sense of from your data, if you're able to discern public versus private, and also the role of insurance in terms of extending that care post-cancer treatment.
Yeah, Ed, another solid question. While we have a very switched on audience today. So just to sort of provide you with a bit of Australian context as well, the government we also have a pretty good public healthcare system, and obviously in the public system, we do not have as much comprehensive support in the rehab space, post-cancer treatment, and return to work. So I suspect that in some ways, the Australian system is very similar to the Canadian system. And you're quite right, because I did this research with Hannover Re, and so a lot of our life insurance customers are actually very privileged, and they're usually white collar. And so sometimes that insurance is also provided through their employer. And so as you can see over here, in terms of the rehab program, a lot of them can actually be very comprehensive, involving ex-phys, physiotherapy, psychologists, occupational therapist. But in the mainstream system, obviously, sometimes you need to pay out of pocket for all these services. And as I mentioned to you earlier, obviously, the greater the coverage, the more successful the return to work. But obviously, with a lower coverage, the return to work will be a lot more strained. I mean, it might be successful at the end, but the time it takes to return to work might be a lot longer. So this would be a short sort of answer to your question. I actually didn't cover the United States, but in another research in the return to workspace, just generally, not cancer related, I found that New Zealand, Australia, Canada, I think the last country is United Kingdom, they actually have a fairly similar system. And so I suspect that in the US, things would be a lot more dire because obviously I know they don't have a very comprehensive public healthcare system for all.
Yeah, I always up here in Canada that in Canada you don't get the best healthcare, and oftentimes we say the best healthcare that money could buy is actually in the US, right? But nonetheless, not everybody has access to the healthcare. At least in Canada, we do have a fairly basic, but it's accessible to everybody. Now, before I get to Mark's question, I do have another question which I can help but want to know, especially from an insurance or insurer's perspective. So you laid out a lot of factors that contributed, that hindered, the success of return to work. Now, one of the things, of course, from an insurer's perspective is who is most likely to return to work, right? Because those are the people that they can minimize in terms of the cost. One of the things that didn't come out, I wonder if that's something that you may have uncovered in the research is the role of personal agency. You have some of these in some of the data that you presented, but when I talk about, personal agency, but I'm also referring to things like um, personality traits, resilience, positive and negative affect. So if somebody who's more positive, is more optimistic, may have greater resilience. Those are the people that the insurance company would want to insure, right? Especially from a business model. On the other hand, of course, and this could be a double-edged sword as well, whether the role of somebody a family member who may also have had cancer experience, that might actually either support somebody's return to work because they have the experience of dealing with cancer somewhere else within a family, right? So I wonder if those data actually at the individual level surface in the review that you have completed.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Ed, just to sort of quickly respond first, the life insurance can't choose their patients. So anyone who's paid
Right.
and sort of engaged them, they have to obviously help. But you're quite right. Personal agency is so important. I didn't quote for personal agency, but obviously something that is really closely related is self-efficacy, as you know, your own belief in your own ability to return to work or that self-confidence. It's such a powerful predictor. Spoken to some life insurers and some rehab providers as well. If the mindset is like, oh, I can't do this, learn helplessness, like, oh, because I have cancer right now, I can't do this, I can't do that, I will never improve. Obviously, the return to work is unlikely to be successful and it will take a painfully long time. But if the mindset has always been positive, despite the fatigue, despite the cancer severity, it's always going to be a lot more positive and there will be a shorter time to return to work. But at the same time, I just sort of wanted to add a caveat. So with the life insurance space as well, there will be coaching and counseling that sort of coach them to change their mindset from obviously one that is like learn helplessness to, I can tackle this, I can do this. And so they also provide that sort of support to cancer survivors. And some of them have actually mentioned that this is even more important than some of the physiotherapy or the exercise physiologist, because you have to first change your mindset because before you start accepting all these other rehab programs. And so you're quite right. I mean, personal agency is so important. They have to be willing. And if you ask me, the more they're willing to, they also will reach out to obviously the rehab provider, and so it's sort of reciprocal. If they're not willing, then they are less likely to also seek help and talk to people, and so it becomes a sort of negative spiral or negative life cycle, and it's just not good for the cancer survivors overall.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I can totally imagine, right? When you're on a downward spiral and you feel sorry for yourself. To your point, and I'm glad Australia is very much like Canada, where insurers cannot pick and choose who they want to insure. And you probably have heard of the fact that in the US, there's pre-existing conditions. If you're high risk, then they can choose not to insure you, right? They send you like a 500 question survey just to make sure that you are low risk before they insure you. All right, I want to come to a question from Mark here. So Mark asks and wants to know if the type of jobs that cancer patients have actually impact their ability to return to work. So it could be, categorized into, high-level jobs, managerial, professional, technical work. Sometimes we call them white-collar work, or some of the could be lower-level work. They tend to be more labor intensive or requiring a lot more physical effort. So I'm not sure if your review actually provided the different types of jobs that will predict the return to work rate.
Well, very good question, Mark. Thank you so much. So in the scoping review, we didn't actually restrict to just a white collar worker. We just considered all studies that collected data. You're quite right. So for blue collar work, labor intensive ones, physically intensive ones, it's going to be very hard to return to the same work. And so one thing I didn't have time to present on was the occupational type and the industries. A lot of obviously in the life insurance space, most of them are office-based workers, white collar, knowledge workers. But when talking about physically demanding laborers, construction workers, or um, that sort of prevented them for a lot of times from returning to the same type of work. They might actually choose a new sort of industry to enter, or sometimes they would take a longer time to rest and recuperate and return to work. And so obviously for blue collar workers, a lot harder, because the number one factor, which is fatigue, can't be sort of, you can't avoid that in that whole cancer treatment phase. And so it's almost impossible for a lot of them to return to the same physically demanding job.
Oh, that's actually good to know, and it's probably something that, that merit, further research down the road. I have one last question because of time. We have a few more questions here, but I'm gonna ask the very last one. Again, this one came from Lisa in Edmonton. Obviously, Australia is diverse, so is Canada, and a lot of the countries that you examine, for instance, New Zealand you mentioned, and the UK. So one of the things, of course, it begs the question, whether race or ethnicity may actually influence, again, the success or the return to work rate. I don't know if you find demographic differences in that respect. I know that your sample had a lot more women than men, but from a racial, ethnic perspective, whether there's a difference there.
Yeah, very good question, Lisa. Thank you. A caveat, most of the large cohort studies, they would break down like Asian, Hispanic, and the ethnicity of the cancer patients, but not for the smaller studies. And so I didn't actually capture the ethnicity. I didn't code for that because after a while, I found that a lot of studies didn't necessarily report that. And so that's why that's one aspect that I didn't code for. But obviously, I must say that in Australia, again, like Canada, we are a multi-racial, multi-ethnic society. We don't discriminate. But I must say that our main mode of language is still English. And so sometimes, obviously, with maybe a patient with English as not as a first language will find it harder to access. And so they have a preference for someone who speaks their own mother tongue. And so from that perspective, it's not really Australia discriminating, but in terms of the access to resources and support, for some of them with English as not as a first language will be a lot harder. And so in some ways, I've seen some studies focusing on culturally and linguistically diverse cancer patients, not many, so obviously a place for further research is that they do the language barrier serves as an additional sort of like complexity and barrier for them to access support. And so you'll find that obviously for some hospitals and some healthcare providers right now, they also tend to hire some native speaker. And obviously in the Department of Health in Australia, we have materials and resources now in multi-languages, acknowledging the multi-ethnicity and multicultural society that Australia is.
It's great to hear, the kind of resources that are being made available to make sort of the services we can make available to a lot more people. On that note, I'm gonna have to that's all the questions. That's all the time we have for the questions today. Carrie, thank you very much for sharing your really valuable research and the insights that you shared with us today, and for taking the time to answer so many questions. As you can tell, we had a lot of questions, but so little time. I also want to apologize that the chat function was not enabled early on. So I now see quite a number of hellos from the participants that I did not see earlier. Also want to give a shout out to Angela as well as Madeline for sharing with us and being vulnerable by sharing your history with us. So thank you for that. So it's time to bring the webinar to a close. Before we exit, I want to put a plug for our next webinar from the People's Cultures and Careers Research Cluster. So I'm here with you on how to write a good review and more. Submit as well. Featuring 5 journal editors: Tim Bathroom, RMIT, who is the editor-in-chief for the Asia Pacific Journal of Human Resources Management; Andrew Jackson, editor for the Australian Journal of Management. So that includes not just OBHR, but also the other areas of business. Lucy Texa, editor for the Journal of Industrial Relations, Pauline Stanton, editor for Personnel Review. I also happen to co-edit that with Pauline. So the date for the webinar has been set for Tuesday, April 29, 11 a.m. Singapore time, which I understand is 1 p.m. Melbourne time now that you're 2 hours ahead of us. If you want a recording for Carrie's presentation today, please check back in a few days by visiting the JC Singapore or the Research Cluster website. Thank you again for spending your time with us today. Happy fall or autumn for all the listeners in the Southern Hemisphere, and spring for listeners who are in the Northern Hemisphere. Good day and good night from Canada.
Thanks, Ed.
Thank you, Carrie.